Good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to invite and welcome all of you to the 16th Dr. Asghar Engineer Memorial Lecture, Does Indian Secularism Have a Future? To be delivered by Professor Rajeev Bhargava and chaired by Professor Faizan Mustafa. I know we have an eminent chair and a very eminent speaker. I will like to withhold you from this beautiful lecture only for 2 minutes because I want to share something about CSSS before we proceed. So the Center for Study of Society and Secularism has been working to promote communal harmony and peace for over 25 years. This includes bringing out a lot of publications, a journal called Indian Journal of Secularism, Secular Perspective, which is 15 or fortnightly commenting on various relevant contemporary issues. Then CSSS, along with its founder, Dr. Asghar Engineer, pioneered fact-finding reports. So we do undertake a lot of fact-finding missions, bring out reports, and various other publications. Apart from this, our field engagement includes having various peace centers in riot-torn areas in India. Um these peace centers try to highlight diversity and promote composite culture, peace, act like bridges when it comes to communities. Uh, and of course, CSSS undertakes a lot of cultural events, again highlighting composite culture, celebrating the Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb that India has. Along with this, we also undertake a lot of memorial lectures, memorial activities really, to pay a fitting tribute to our founder member, founder chairperson, Dr. Asghar Engineer. Uh, the memorial lectures is just one of such activities. Other being we give a best published paper award, and the latest one, as I think many of you must be aware, was the Memorial Dr. Asghar Engineer Memorial Award for Lifetime Achievement, which was conferred posthumously on Justice Suresh. So these are the range of activities we undertake. And I don't think I should keep you away from the lecture anymore. But just before we begin, we would also like to express solidarity with the peasant movement or the agitation going on. I think it's an important issue. And uh, when we're talking about secularism, we can't ignore these democratic processes and democratic movements that are taking place in the country. So we express solidarity with that. With this, I would like to just make one more announcement before we begin. We have a lot of participants, over 200 participants who have already joined us, and I'm sure there will be a lot of questions that the participants would like to pose to Professor Bhargav and Professor Faizan Mustafa. Please leave your questions in the chat box. To accommodate more questions, we will be reading them out and posing it to both of them, and they both will patiently answer them. But we will not be able to unmute anyone. Please leave your questions in the chat box. With this, I would like to invite Vinod Mubai. Vinod Mubai is the patron of CSSS. He has joined us all the way from New York. He is a nuclear scientist in New York and has been associated with CSSS and Dr. Asghar Engineer for a very, very long time, for decades. So there is no one better than him to really speak about Dr. Asghar Engineer. So I invite him to speak a few words.
Thank you very much, Neha, and good evening to everyone in India. Good morning to anyone in the US who has joined our meeting. It is a great pleasure.
Uncle, can you be a little louder?
Yeah, it is a great pleasure and a privilege for me to say a few words about my old friend and comrade, Asghar Ali Engineer. We first met in Bombay in 1969 at a meeting that was called by progressive groups in Bombay when I had just returned from the US after doing my PhD and joined PIFR. And Asghar Bhai then was an engineer in the Bombay Municipal Corporation. Our shared interest was first in communal harmony where we started the anti-communal youth front, which Asghar Bhai was a key figure in, and we had persuaded the great actor Balraj Sani to be our president. And this organization, young organization, played a significant role in the Bhivandi riots in 1970, uh, where we were very active and made our name known uh, through Greater Bombay and in Maharashtra. Now, what I remember most that Asghar Bhai was a man committed to peace between communities and also ending exploitation. He was very sensitive, secular, progressive, rational, with a philosophical interest in Marxism, along with an attachment to Islam that he had imbibed at a young age in his childhood when he grew up, and from whose fundamental principles he distilled a liberation theology which was similar to what radical Catholic priests were preaching in Latin America in the 1970s, and which other progressive thinkers like Swami Agnivesh, who left us a few weeks ago, did for Hinduism and other religious thinkers. His studies of communal rights in India are, of course, a classic that are made his name known all over the world and established him both as an activist and a front-rank intellectual whose theories of communal conflict were based on real empirical data. He left the discipline of engineering and the corporation to become a full-time activist, and he promoted various ventures, including, most importantly, the Center for the Studies of Society and Secularism, under whose auspices we are meeting today in his memories. He was also unique as an activist at ending feudal rule in his own Daudi Bohra communities, despite, as everyone perhaps knows, physical assaults on him, excommunication, ostracism, and so forth. He exemplified a principle that democracy, like charity, should begin at home. A very humble and simple person, I really was privileged to be his close friend and associate even after I moved back to the US in the late 70s. We kept in constant touch, maybe once a week, once a month, and I invited him for many lecture tours here in the US in the 1980s and 1990s. And we had the chance to spend a lot of time together when he came on his visits and met a variety of people across the entire US and Canada here. He must have come at least 8 or 10 times on visits. He hated hierarchy and power, and there are many amusing and insightful, perhaps, episodes of that we experienced together when we met, occasionally met with powerful figures like governors, etc., in our activities in the early 70s. And he just could not stand this whole pomp and power that people in high government service, etc., would would exert. So the outstanding quality of him that I remember is his deep sense of compassion for the oppressed and the underprivileged. especially Dalits, lower caste Muslims, women, minorities, etc., in all of which he left an indelible mark. So I salute his memory, and I, of course, miss him every day. I think about it, and we try to carry on in our age as best as we can, remembering him and remembering all his efforts. Thank you very much.
May I invite Irfan Engineer, the director of CSSS, to speak something about the lecture, the Dr. Asghar Ali Engineer Memorial Lecture.
Thank you, Neha. Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasant duty to talk a few words, very, very few words about the memorial lecture. Through this Asghar Ali Engineer Memorial Lecture, we try to continue the legacy of Dr. Engineer. The first memorial lecture was in 2013 itself, a few months after Dr. Engineer was no more with us. Uh, Historians, political scientists, sociologists, and Islamic scholars have delivered this memorial lecture. Amongst those who have delivered, I can take just but a few names. Professor Faizan Mustafa has delivered memorial lecture. Professor Romila Thapar, Professor Cole Durham from US came to deliver the lecture. Christoph Jefferlot, Dietrich Reeds, Wajahat Habibullah, Professor Imtiaz Yusuf from Mahidol University, Bangkok, Sukhdev Thorat, Professor Mushirul Hassan, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, Akil Bilgrami, Professor Irfan Habib, and A.G. Nurani are a few of them who have delivered this memorial lecture. We are fortunate enough to get very good speakers all this time, and very good speaker today also. So without much ado, now I'll invite Professor Kamla Ganesh, who is a member of our Center for Study of Society and Secularism, to introduce our speakers and the chair today. She's Professor Kamla Ganesh is also retired as head of Sociology Department, University of Mumbai. So I invite Professor Kamla Ganesh to introduce today's speaker and chair.
Thank you, Irfan. Good evening, everybody. It is my privilege to briefly introduce the two eminent speakers. Questions on secularism in India and Indian secularism are for some decades now part of a highly acrimonious and incendiary political and social debate. These phrases are widely used, misused, and abused in popular discourses. For anyone from political science or any other field who wishes to get clarity and insight, Professor Rajeev Bhargava's writings on the subject over 3 decades are a crucial reference point. His work on secularism, the constitution, and on political theory that engages with the Indian context does not stop with academic research. His erudite books, What is Political Theory and Why We Need It, The Promise of India's Secular Democracy, Politics and Ethics of the Indian Constitution, and the much cited Secularism and its Critics are, among others, are examples of his academic work, but he has also written accessible textbooks for college students and newspaper columns, and his delineation of the crucial distinctions between constitutional secularism and party political secularism have indeed framed the terms of the debate. Professor Bhargava is currently Honorary Fellow at Center for the Study of Developing Societies and Director of its Parekh Institute of Indian Thought. He was earlier the Center's Director. He has been a professor at the Center for Political Studies Jawaharlal Nehru University, and head Department of Political Studies, University of Delhi. He has studied in the universities of Delhi and Oxford, has been fellow and visiting professor at many prestigious institutions in the US at Harvard, Columbia, New York University, and Stanford, in UK, Europe, China, and Australia. He's currently working religious and philosophical pluralism in ancient Indian thought. For us at the center of the study of society and secularism, Professor Bhargava's erudition, insights, and accessibility are vitally relevant for our research, reflection, and action. There could not have been a more appropriate person for delivering this Asghar Ali Engineer Memorial Lecture, and I'm not saying this as a formality. The chair for today's lecture, Professor Faizan Mustafa, whose accomplishments and experience are a perfect foil for the speaker, Professor Bhargava. Currently, Professor Mustafa is the Vice Chancellor of Nalsar University of Law, Hyderabad. He has been a senior constitutional law teacher, academic administrator, and associated with several important institutions. He was founder, National Law University, Odisha, and then the KIT Law School, Bhubaneswar. He has been advisor to the Law School and Judicial Academy in Assam, Dean, Faculty of Law, Aligarh Muslim University. He was also the president of Consortium of National Law Universities. He has been much decorated with fellowships such as the Commonwealth and Fulbright, and was the winner of SARC's Best Law Teacher Award in 2014. He has been president of the prestigious Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute, which is a binational organization of Canadian and Indian governments. A prolific writer in academic platforms, he also regularly writes in the leading newspapers and magazines on current legal issues. He has been oft quoted by the Supreme Court. Recently and notably, it quoted his article on religious freedom in the Sabarimala judgment. So Professor Bhargava and Professor Mustafa, we look forward to a double treat this evening. May I request Professor Bhargava to deliver his lecture.
Unmute. Have I unmuted myself? Yes. Thank you, Dr. Ganesh, for this generous introduction. I'm really deeply honored to speak on this important and prestigious occasion. And I thank Irfan Bhai for inviting me to give this lecture in memory of Dr. Asghar Ali, engineer. I'm also delighted that Professor Mustafa has agreed to chair this lecture, and I look forward to his comments. Like so many others, I'd come to know about Asghar Sam long before I met him. We were all struck by his exemplary physical and moral courage in attacking communalism, in defending secularism, but most of all in publicly dissenting from the religious orthodoxy within his own Bohra community. After all, he almost lost his life criticizing his own religion. I began to meet him in the late 80s in seminar and conferences. On one such occasion, I had the honor and pleasure of meeting him for 3-4 consecutive days. We were invited to an international conference at the University of Hull by Professor Bhikkhu Parekh. I think the year was 90 or 1991. We stayed at the same hotel in adjacent rooms, had breakfast, lunch, and dinner together, traveled back to London together by train, and therefore had ample time to have long conversations. As we all know, an unintended but welcome intimacy always develops when Indians go abroad for some common purpose. Whenever we met thereafter, though I confess it wasn't that often, I'm proud to say that we met as friends. My argument in the paper that I gave at Hull was built on a distinction between the content of religious beliefs and practices and the form in which they are encased. by which I meant the manner in which these beliefs are held, and therefore the way they affect the way we carry our identity. Content-wise, at that time, I believed that secular and religious identities are very different and sometimes even opposed. But form-wise, they can, I argued, be similar, even identical. For beliefs can be held by us dogmatically, as if we are in possession of an exclusive truth, unavailable to others, who, being different from us, hold only false beliefs, with whom conversation is useless. Or else they can be held with humility, with an open-mindedness, in the knowledge that no one has grasp of the whole truth. If both secular and religious identities are held, or beliefs are held dogmatically, resulting in hardened categorical identities, the conflict between the two is inevitable. But conflicting content need not result in fierce conflicts if religious and secular beliefs are held firmly, yet lightly, open-mindedly, with humility. They can then coexist with mutual respect. The two can even come together to fight religious zealots or intolerant secularists. Asghar Ali, Engineer Saab, responded very well to the paper and gave me very generous comments. And this made me realize another quality of his, humility. Asghar Ali, Engineer, approached everyone with humility, both those who supported and followed him and those who were opposed to him. There were two other qualities in him that stood out. First, commitment. Commitment to his particular religious beliefs, to his community. And here I must emphasize the quality of that commitment, for he understood that the more committed one is to the good of one's religion, the more one loves and identifies with one's community, the more upsetting it is to find flaws within it, and the greater the imperative to act to remove the blemishes in it. Commitment and internal critique often go together. This was something that I found really very striking in Dr. Engineer. And finally, indefatigability. He worked tirelessly for his own religious community, strived hard to ward off communalism and defend secularism. He was multiply engaged, always involved with social and political issues. And in this, he reminds me of a common friend who passed away recently, Swami Agnivesh. And I take this occasion to pay my personal tributes to him too, another fearless fighter like Asghar Sahib, very similar in outlook, although he was Hindu, who was virtually martyred for the cause dear to him. So as we remember Asghar Sahib today, we also celebrate these great human qualities, qualities that forever inspire us: intellectual courage, humility, commitment, and tireless multiple engagement. In short, this is an occasion to remember not only that exemplary person, but to celebrate the admirable human qualities he embodied. Let me now come to my presentation today, and I would begin by placing it in the current intellectual context. I'm referring to an interesting exchange that has recently taken place in the media between Yogendra Yadav and Pratap Bhanu Mehta. This intellectual encounter between these two fine commentators on Indian politics and society was thoughtful and incisive, but I believed it conflated two equally important but separate questions. The first asks for an explanation for why and how secularism has run into deep crisis, and why further it is in even greater danger in the last few years. This is a question about causation, namely, what are the social, economic, and political factors that has brought about the ever-deepening crisis of secularism? The answer to this question may begin with causal factors such as the rise of right-wing populism, often taking the form of a virulent majoritarianism or authoritarian nationalism, the shrinking of democratic space, and the blatant disregard for the rule of law. These account for the current grave threat to secularism, or what has been described as its defeat. But the answer may go back in time to the prior failure to address rising economic inequalities, thanks to a new rampant capitalism, and further back in time to the global vacuum created by the collapse of the Soviet Union, and even further back to the resurgence of militant religions, particularly radicalized political Islams, in the year 1979. This diachronic account explains why this crisis has been growing for some time now. However, there is a second question, which relates to what, for want of a better term, we might call intellectual factors. Here we ask, what precisely are the reasons behind secularism losing the moral power that it once had to attract Indian people, particularly the Hindu middle class? This presupposes an account of the best possible interpretation of Indian secularism that explains its original appeal, why people found it inspiring, why they identified with it, why they were propelled to defend it when it was under attack. Now, when this vision loses its appeal, this might be due either to a fundamental change in society, in the transformed character of the very persons who earlier embraced it. And I believe something of this kind has happened in India in the last 30 years, since 1991. Or because a new discursive account of secularism has come into being or has been manufactured that carries little of its original appeal, that has lost the ethical force of the original vision, its attraction. These two questions are related. The answer to the second question, as Professor Charles Taylor has pointed out in a different context, has an important bearing to the answer to the first, because ideas themselves play an important causal role in explaining changes in important state of affairs. But the issue here is what precise causal weight to give to these intellectual factors. So we have two separate questions, and we have to decide what causal weight to give to ideational factors in the overall explanation of the crisis of secularism. Now, in this exchange, both Yogendra and Pratap give the impression that they find their respective accounts to be sufficient for understanding and explaining the crisis of Indian secularism. Pratap assumes that Yogen is trying to answer the first causal question and finds his answer utterly inadequate to explain the ferocity and venom with which Muslims are under attack and secularism so severely endangered. Pratap's assumption is not entirely unjustified because Yogen never clarifies that his focus is on the second question, namely the intellectual question. As an answer to the first question, his account is very dissatisfactory. But then Pratap too fails to distinguish the two questions. He does not grasp that really Yogen's focus is on the second. If he had realized this, he wouldn't have seen Yogen's answers he would have seen that Yogen's answers have some plausibility. Secularism has lost its appeal among sections of Hindus because secularism did not connect secularism with a language of tradition, particularly Hindu traditions. They did not speak or learn from the language of religion. They often, as Yogen puts it, mocked Hinduism instead of developing a version of it suitable to our times. Now, this answer, I think, goes in the right direction as long as you see it as an answer to the second question. It does help us identify precisely what in this normative idea has begun to leave many Indians cold and indifferent to its fate. Indeed, for more than a decade now, I've been doing precisely that, to try to give not only the best possible interpretation of Indian secularism, that of course I've been doing, as was pointed out, for 3 decades now, but identify which changes in it explain its current malaise, to locate its conceptual flaws and find a suitable version that might make it attractive again, not perhaps to all Indians, I don't think that's possible, but at least to enough of them to make a critical difference. So here I try to give a detailed, a fuller answer to the second question, namely, what is its original appeal and why it has declined, and what can we do to restore it, or to rework it, to rejuvenate it, refashion it, rehabilitate secularism. I begin my story of Indian secularism when Indians were on the brink of independence, but not before providing a partly fictitious account, and it is a fictitious account, of its historical setting. Imagine a world in which different faiths, modes of worship, philosophical outlooks, and social religious practices exist side by side. Deep diversity is accepted as part of the natural landscape. Syrian Christians, Zoroastrians, Jews, Muslims, either Arab traders who came for trade naturally, or Turks and Afghans who came initially as conquerors but settled down, not to speak of a variety of South Asian faiths. All were at home. To feel and be secure was a basic psychosocial condition. All groups exhibit basic self-confidence possible only when trust exists between communities. There is no deep anxiety about the other who does not represent an existential threat. That is not to say that there are no deep intellectual disagreements and conflicts, some of which even lead to violent skirmishes, but these do not issue in major wars or religious persecution. Now, I believe that this approximates, and I say only approximates, the social religious world of the Indian subcontinent, more or less till the advent of colonial modernity, and constitutes the background condition of civility and coexistence in India. Indeed, it's not entirely mistaken to say that until then, India had not undergone a full-fledged process of religionization, the process by which loose community of faiths, nourished by the rituals or teachings or one or more traditions, are transformed into bounded, well-demarcated, rivalrous communities to one of which all members of a society belong and thereby have a fixed, well-differentiated categorical identity. To be sure, a rough crystallization of religious communities may have taken place in the early modern period, but the idea of modern religion was consolidated in Indian culture like never before in the past, only by the last decades of the 19th century. After this, it became possible to count the number of heads belonging to each religion. Religionization was coterminous with the formation of national communities, including Hindu and Muslim nations. With this, the background condition of civility and harmony was unsettled. Religious coexistence could now no longer be taken for granted. Doubts about coexistence forced themselves upon the public arena, and religious coexistence became a problematic issue to be spoken about and publicly articulated. An explicit invocation and defense of the idea became necessary that all religions must be at peace with one another, coexist with trust and comfort. And if this trust is undermined, if this mutual confidence is broken, then it must be restored. It is around this time that a project of what came to be called communal harmony, dependent less on the state and more society-led, began to take shape, with Gandhi as its principal articulator. Now, despite the entry and growth of a discourse of communal harmony, matters continue to get worse, however. From the late 1920s, sections of Hindu and Muslim elites were sucked into what can be called a majority-minority syndrome, a diseased network of neurotic relations so completely poisoned and accompanied by such a vertiginous assortment of negative emotions like envy, malice, jealousy, spite, hatred, that animosity between groups circulated freely, adding layer upon layer of grievances, and antagonistic games were played with no end in mind except the defeat and humiliation of the other. Ambedkar provides several examples in his book on the partition, or a book on what I don't remember what it's called, but it's on the formation of Pakistan. Hindus and Muslims make preparations against each other, he tells us, without abatement, reminding one of a, and I quote, race and armaments between two hostile nations. If the Hindus have the Banaras University, the Muslims must have the Aligarh University. If the Muslims launch the Tabligh movement, the Hindus must start a Shuddhi movement, and so on. A section of the Muslim elites had entered, it seemed, a state of paranoia that was only partly grounded in fears of interreligious domination. That is to say, domination by members of one religion, of members of another religion or another religious community. But eventually, this became a very real prospect for those who stayed behind in India after the formation of Pakistan. This was no longer imaginary fear, but a real thing for people who stayed behind. The majority-minority syndrome had another consequence. In the 19th century, a number of freedom and equality-related or equality-centered reform movements had been initiated within Hindus and Muslims. But the syndrome set off by intercommunal rivalry forestalled these reforms, intensifying anti-reformist tendencies. Once again, Ambedkar grasped this point well. When people regard each other as a menace, all energies are spent on meeting this menace. I'm quoting here. The exigencies of a common front against one another generates a conspiracy of silence over social evils. Internal dissent and conflict is quashed in favor of the idea that everyone must close ranks or the community would weaken, quotes closed. In other words, prospects of intra-religious domination, that is, domination by members of a religious community of members of their own community, had also grown by the time of India's independence. These religious reform movements or social reform movements had been stalled. It was in such a context, replete with continuing inter and intra-religious domination, that independent India had to decide the character of the newly instituted state and its relationship with religion. It had clearly two options: either to have a polity that consolidates both forms of inter-religious domination, a patriarchal, upper caste-dominated Hindu majoritarian state, or to have a secular state that blocks these tendencies and tries to reduce both these forms of domination. In 1950, when India was declared a republic, it chose the second option, with the explicit objective of dealing with both these forms of institutionalized religious domination. In doing so, two distinctive conceptions of political secularism were developed, one Gandhian and the other that I call constitutional Indian secularism. The first took inspiration from Gandhi's social project of communal harmony, was believed to be wholly homegrown, and was variously called Sarvadharm Sambhava or Pantha Nirpekshata. While the originality of this project cannot be denied, it has often been touted as the official state-led Indian secularism, competing with and virtually eclipsing constitutional secularism. I have claimed instead that the Gandhian conception is largely subsumed by constitutional secularism, which better articulates our secular vision. While the emphasis given to communal harmony is important and in certain contexts sorely needed, constitutional secularism has a more balanced approach to religious communities. So, as I said, in what follows, I explain what these two conceptions are, trace their trajectories, and in the final section, briefly indicate where the current discourse of Indian secularism stands, why it has fallen in bad times, and why we must do something about it now. How much time have I taken? Already quite a lot, isn't it? I would actually maybe skip the Gandhian conception because I don't want to spend too much time on it, except for saying that that although Gandhi felt that a large part of the responsibility for maintaining communal harmony lies with members of the communities themselves, and communal harmony is a people-dependent notion, one that Gandhi believed was already part of popular Indian consciousness. In India, somehow this idea began to find articulation in public discourse as secularism, and it became sort of a dominant idea that the state must show Sarvadharm Sambhav, be equally well disposed to all paths, gods, all religions, even all philosophical conceptions of the ultimate good. And as an entity separate from all religions, the state was to ensure trust between religious communities, to restore basic confidence if and when it was undermined. This, of course, happens under conditions when there is a threat of interreligious domination. So in this conception, secularism refers to a comportment of the state whereby it maintains distance from all religious and philosophical conceptions in order to promote a certain quality of fraternity or sociability among religious communities, perhaps even interreligious equality. Now, this makes Gandhian secularism distinctive. Unlike modern Western secularisms that separate church and state for the sake of individual freedom and equality, and have place for neither community nor fraternity, the Gandhian conception demands that the state be secular for better relations between members of all religious communities, especially in times when they're estranged. So I must say that I find it very original, and this is a very attractive idea that Gandhi developed, or the Gandhians developed. But it's different from what I consider to be the main governing model of Indian secularism, which I call constitutional Indian secularism. Now, constitutional Indian secularism translates Gandhian political secularism, an adversary of interreligious domination, into the language of rights. It does so by ensuring that religious communities that are smaller in number have rights that protect them from multiple disadvantages. At the same time, it also goes beyond interreligious issues to incorporate a transformative agenda aimed at reducing intra-religious domination. It is its opposition to both forms of institutionalized religious domination that makes Indian constitutional secularism really distinctive. So what is the relationship between a constitutional state and religion that it wishes to partially transform? And I actually see Indian constitution as a charter for the reform of Indian religions. I think other people have also mentioned this, but I've increasingly come to believe that that is a very significant part of the vision of the Constitution. Now, to answer this question, the relationship between constitutional state and religion, I begin with a distinction between individual ethics of self-fulfillment and social norms of everyday conduct. By the first, I mean a framework for meaningful living and dying, say a full life in this world, Swarga, Jannat, or heaven in another world, or freedom from recurrent births and deaths, moksha, nirvana, and so on. By social norms of everyday conduct, I mean rituals and ceremonies of social interaction, but primarily norms governing interpersonal relations, with whom one should or should not interact, who one should or should not marry, with whom one should or should not dine, who is to perform which job in society, and so on. Ethics of self-fulfillment and norms of social conduct may be so tightly connected that they form one single system. Or the connection between them may be so loose that they're seen to constitute two separate systems. Now, in the Abrahamic traditions, as I see it, the connection between ethics and social norms was increasingly forged so tightly that they became part of a single, deeply connected system. And the term religion, within quotes, was invented to refer to this whole, to this entire system. The process by which this tight connection is forged is what I call religionization. Thus, if a person chose to be, say, a Latin Christian, he instantly became part of this entire system. Adopting a particular set of Christian beliefs on salvation went hand in hand with taking part in specific Christian rituals and ceremonies. and entering a web of unequal social relations with non-Christians. It would be wrong and impermissible for a person with Christian beliefs to participate in non-Christian social rituals or even to tolerate pagans. For this reason, a religion-centered social revolution in Europe meant A, breaking the monopoly of Christianity, presenting options other than dominant Christian ideas of self-fulfillment, that is to say, pluralization of ethics in the sense in which I've used the term. B, loosening the connection between ethics and social norms, freeing social norms from Christian ethics, building norms of social equality that transcended religious identities, what I call, broadly secularization. And C, fighting a church that blocked secularization and pluralization. By contrast, the connection between ethics and social norms remained very loose in Indian traditions, at least in the past. Because social norms and power hardly ever dictated the choice of ethics, there was greater innovation, and so ethical frameworks proliferated. People could move freely from one framework to another, and sometimes without any discomfort, participate in several. And yet, precisely because social norms existed independently of ethics, this very ethical flexibility went hand in hand with great rigidity within social norms. This is so because hierarchical and fixed caste relations lay at the core of these norms. Ironically, they even complemented each other. As long as one remained within the caste system and one knew one's place in the caste system, one can choose any ethical framework, any path to self-fulfillment. A person could find fulfillment in a loving relationship with Krishna, in achieving Swarga, in liberation from the cycle of rebirth, and at the same time follow common norms governing unequal social relations. A person may quit a this-worldly Vedic ethic in order to lead an ascetic Jain life, but all the while continue to belong to the Vaishya caste and therefore remain enmeshed in hierarchical caste relations. And this was true even for those who became Christians or Muslims. They chose a modified Abrahamic ethic, but remained firmly entrenched in the caste system. Now, given that the term religion was invented within Latin Christianity to refer to a single system, it was not easily applicable in the subcontinent where ethics and social norms do not cohere into one single whole. Yet such is the force and sway of the term religion that it has been simultaneously used to refer to two relatively distinct and independent systems of first ethics and second social norms. This has generated many problems and much confusion. I'd like to explain this point by giving you a simple example from the natural sciences and to grasp the absurdity of this profound misnaming. The term water refers to a single entity composed of two distinct elements, oxygen and hydrogen. Where the two gases are deeply connected to form a single compound, the term water is appropriate. But we rightly use two distinct terms, hydrogen and oxygen, for each when the two remain disconnected from each other. How utterly erroneous to call them water when they exist separately. Calling distinct system of ethics and social norms in India by the common term religion is equally insane. But then once a term grips the popular imagination, it's difficult to dislodge it. Some scholars have therefore tried to get out of this hole by using religion in two different senses: ethical religion on the one hand and social religion on the other. Now, though not entirely satisfactory, we might accept this for our purposes and say that in India, a profound pluralism of ethical religions exists, yet followers of different ethical religions participate in much the same caste-ridden social religion. Now, how does all this help us to understand the relationship of our constitution to Indian religions? Unlike Europe, where people have to fight for the pluralization of ethics, or they've had to fight from 15th, 16th century onwards for the pluralization of ethics, here we strive to conserve the immense pluralism of our ethical religions, to act against any attempted religious homogenization or exclusion. The Indian Constitution performs this quote unquote conservative function. B, by preventing a tight connection between social norms and ethical religion, the Indian Constitution also ensures that we do not have religion as conceived in exclusionary monotheistic traditions, something as totalizing as Latin Christianity once was, or perhaps Saudi Islam, although I don't know as well about it, or as Saudi Islam now is. And C, finally, its main objective is to destroy what is at the core of India's dominant social religion, its deeply hierarchical caste system and its gender-based hierarchies. So a number of features mark Indian secularism. First, a distinction is drawn between the identity of the state, which is made largely independent of religion, and an important but limited sphere where religion is officially recognized and religious freedom is guaranteed. Here are Articles 25 to 30. B, the qualification for citizenship, where membership in the state is made wholly independent of religious affiliation, but a small number of important rights are mediated by membership in religious communities. So we have some kind of a limited and moderated, differentiated citizenship rights in Articles 26 to 30. C, the state is required to be equally well or ill disposed to all religions. No religion is supposed to be politically dominant or favored by the state. More interestingly, and this is the fourth point, religion is understood to be a complex, morally ambiguous phenomena, some aspects of which deserve respect and non-intervention, other aspects that deserve respect requiring positive intervention from the state, that is to say some help, and still others active disrespect and state intervention, namely ban on untouchability, the potential to reform personal laws, and so on. In short, there is no blanket disrespect towards religion, nor an unqualified respect for them, but rather an attitude of critical respect. This is crucial given the virtual impossibility of distinguishing the religious from the social, as B.R. Ambedkar famously observed. Every aspect of religious doctrine or practice cannot be respected. Respect for religion must be accompanied by critique. This attitude of critical respect finds expression in law and public policy in the form of what I've called principal distance. The strict separation of the French and American variety is rejected. Also abandoned is a policy of favoring one religion, as still exists in parts of Western Europe or in the Middle East, and I think including Israel. Indeed, the state has to constantly decide when to engage or disengage, when to help or hinder religion, and it does so depending entirely on which of these enhances our constitutional commitment to freedom, equality, and fraternity. In sum, two features distinguish India's constitutional secularism from other secularisms. A, critical respect for, and B, principled distance from all religions. In India, the state must have critical respect for and principled distance from all religions to undermine inter-religious and intra-religious domination, or alternatively put, for the sake of freedom and equality across and within religions and fraternity among them. And given this complexity, this constitutional secularism cannot be sustained by governments alone, but require collective commitment from an impartial judiciary, a scrupulous media, civil society activists, an alert citizenry, and of course, intellectuals. Now, I think I wouldn't go into what really makes it distinctive. I mean, just to briefly point out that if we had adopted the French model, we would not be able to recognize religion even in the limited sphere that we do. We would not be able to give minority rights, for example, to religious communities. We would always have, in the softer version, we would have active disrespect for religion. Freedom of religion would not be as valued as citizenship as a dominant identity. and that citizenship has no religious marker. So we do not follow the French model. Our constitution does not embody the French model in any way. We have limited disrespect, unlike possibly, although this is not always exercised, possibly a great degree of hostility to at least control religion. Unlike the US, again, where separation is understood as mutual exclusion, I'm talking about the models here, not the actual practice. I think this is a mistake that is always, I think it's misleading. There is a misleading presence of this in some of my own writings. This is the dominant sort of model, at least for most of us outside the US, is one of wall of separation, where the state can neither help nor hinder religion. Now, if we were to follow this model, the wall of separation model, then there would be no way that we would have banned untouchability. We wouldn't be able to reform personal laws. We wouldn't be able to provide state subsidy to any religious community, and certainly not establish rights for religious minorities. So there is no passive respect by non-interference in India. We have, as I said, principled distance and critical respect. And likewise for many West European countries. Now, like Western European countries, we too, in our constitution, have a large number of citizenship rights, which are independent of religion, and they are individualistically construed. But after initial hostility to the church, I mean, and this is a pattern that is followed throughout Western Europe, not only in France, but in other countries as well. After initial hostility to church, at some later point, most of the states had become friendly to one religion or to one church of the religion. This took a form of active respect, which means the states actually helped or favored them. In fact, official recognition is given in the form of weak establishments, even now in at least 8 Western European countries. So there is no acknowledgement of deep religious diversity in most of the constitutions of Western Europe. And that is not surprising, because all these models grew in predominantly single religion societies. I mean, secularism arose there after a great deal of, I would say, unethical religious homogenization had already taken place. Religious diversity was not an issue. The main issue was the church of a single religion and how politically meddlesome and socially oppressive it had become. So naturally, secularism was conceived as separation of church and state to safeguard individual rights. But there was no question of safeguarding collective rights or minority rights. So this is what Indian secularism, in my view, is. And it's very important to judge any deviation of secularism by these Indian standards, not to judge them by the wall of separation model or the French model, which are very distinct, or from the Western European one, and so on. And so now let me come to the current state of the discourse of secularism in India, which is the last part of my presentation. Now, I accept that forces have been unleashed more recently that attack the secular ethos of our country in a manner that is more blatant and persistent. But it would be foolish not to admit that wittingly or unwittingly, deliberately or unintentionally, various social and political groups have been chipping away at the secular edifice so that gradually over time, its legitimacy has been eroded. Indeed, my focus is on the discourse of secularism led by secularists themselves. I think that its power, its attraction, and its appeal has vanished because we secularists ourselves, I mean, those who defend it, we lost our way somewhere. So I do not mean to suggest for a moment that it is this which has contributed more to the crisis of secularism than all the external factors that I mentioned. I think the external factors have a much greater causal role to play in the undermining of secularism in India. But I just simply don't want to focus on that. I want to focus on internal factors. These seem to be within our control, and we can somehow reshape secularism, because it's sort of more in our hands, and restore the moral appeal and power that it has. And that's what I'm going to do. So where have we gone wrong with the discourse of secularism? Now, as part of this answer, I'll state 5 propositions. My first point relates to something important that is almost completely absent from a discourse of secularism. That is to say, the religionization of ethics and faith. Now, this process was fast-tracked and consolidated in Europe during and after the wars of religion in 16th, 17th century. But in India, it did not emerge until, I've mentioned this, until the 19th century. The history of the subcontinent is littered with millions of individuals and groups having taken steps to form multiple ethical religions, sometimes with fluid and at other times with more rigid and exclusive attachments, but a full-blooded idea of a bounded community, of a tightly knit system of ethics and social norms, seeking exclusive allegiance was at best marginal, not center stage. Fuzzy communities, multiple allegiances, fluid and hybrid and composite identities were possibly the norm. The introduction of the idea of full-grown comprehensive religion had, I believe, a dramatic and somewhat disastrous impact on early religious formation that still persists in India. Yet I believe this process of religionization is to some extent still reversible. Older religious formations are still very much around and have a fairly stable presence. It follows that religionization is still incomplete and therefore unstable. Reversing this religionization of ethics, of faiths and traditions, or perhaps even rituals and philosophies, should be one of the primary tasks of the secular project in India. Secular practice has partially recognized this when, for example, in its invocation of Kabir, or a figure such as Lal Der in Kashmir, or more recently Sai Baba of Shirdi. But the issue has never found a powerful, a forceful normative formulation. I believe these religious currents must be supported actively by society and by the state. However, since one must acknowledge at least a partial religionization of faiths and philosophical outlooks, constitutional secularism must try to prevent the formation of religions and confront religions as they are, or there already. And with this, I move to my second claim. Those who defend secularism have frequently lost sight of the whole point behind a secular state, what secularism is for. Most Indian secularists have frequently defended not the complex, sophisticated Indian constitutional model that simultaneously opposes both forms of institutionalized religious domination, but instead some very limited and partial version of it, or worse, one or the other of the Western variants that have very little to do with Indian. Well, I shouldn't say that, that's a very strong statement, but that really are not Indian. They're not Indian variants. They've alternatingly defended a secularism that is anti-religious, alienating the religious by failing to treat them as citizens worthy of equal respect, sometimes put their force behind an a-religious secularism, failing to understand that no modern state can keep itself aloof from religion, especially in places like India, where religion cannot easily be separated from the social and the cultural, and sometimes chosen to support a vulgar form of Gandhian multi-religious secularism that has a high propensity to tolerate indefensible social religious practices and that cries foul every time the state intervenes in religion. This has got defenders of secularism into a mess. They've allowed the state to intervene in religion when they should not have, to intervene when restraint was desperately needed, and frequently continue to respect aspects of religion not worthy of respect. And they've disrespected those facets that deserve respect. An acute understanding of the complex and variegated ways in which inter and intra-religious domination persists in the interstices of Indian society has been elusive, and therefore has been challenged, if at all, only half-heartedly. My third proposition, that Indian secularism is not anti-religious, that Indian secularism is not anti-religious is widely understood, but not that it is simultaneously against both forms of institutionalized religious domination. Now, how did this misunderstanding grow? First, these two struggles, the one against inter-religious domination, that is to say, a defense of minority rights, opposite to majority and minority communalism, became separated from the other, intra-religious domination. So religion-related patriarchy and caste domination, fanaticism, bigotry, and extremism, and so on. Then this intra-religious dimension was ejected from the meaning of secularism, and much to the detriment of its overall value, secularism began to be identified by proponents and opponents alike exclusively with the defense of minority rights, as a device for the protection of minorities, especially Muslims. This opened the door for viewing secularism first as a tool to protect the interests of Muslims and Christians, apparently with no relevance to Hindus, and then for twisting it to appear as pro-Muslim and anti-Hindu. The strength of Indian secularism is advocacy of minority cultural rights. Where is it? Yeah. The strength of Indian secularism, its advocacy of minority cultural rights, was easily made to appear as its weakness. And the burden of its defense, rather than be shared by all citizens, fell on the minorities and pro-minority secularists. Now, this is unfair, partly because it puts the entire burden of defending secularism on minorities and on secularists who are sensitive to the rights of minorities. But secularism is needed as much to protect Hindus and others from intra-religious domination, from their own fanatics, from their own orthodox elements and extremists, and from proponents of religion-based caste and gender hierarchies. Sorry. Indeed, there are good reasons to believe that a causal nexus exists, and I think this is a very important point in my view, that there are good reasons to believe that a causal nexus exists between a failure to address intra-religious domination, in particular caste hierarchies, and the intensification of inter-religious domination. The more one ducks the problem of caste hierarchies by taking refuge in a discourse of upper caste-led Hindu identity, the more intensified the scapegoating of minorities and Christians, and the deeper the abyss into which secularism falls. I fear far from challenging this reduction, Indian secularists have frequently accepted it. My fourth proposition has to do with secularism's frequent failure to distinguish communitarianism from communalism. Communitarianism simply notes that an individual is at least partly defined by his or her religious and philosophical commitments, by his community and traditions. Therefore, I think it's entirely appropriate for someone to claim that he's a Hindu, a Muslim, a Sikh, a Christian, an atheist, and so on, and even to take legitimate pride in one's community or be ashamed of it when there is good reason to. Communalism is different. Here, one's identity and the existence and interests of one's community are viewed, even defined, as necessarily opposed to others. It is communal to believe or act in a way that presupposes that one can't be a Hindu without being anti-Muslim or vice versa. Communalism is communitarianism gone sour. It is to see each other as enemies locked in a permanent war with one another. every decent Indian national should be against communalism, but no one should decry legitimate forms of communitarianism. I think Asghar Ali, engineer, exemplified this. It's simply wrong to conflate communitarianism with communalism. Now, the conflation of communitarian and communal in India is often meant that secular persons with a Hindu background or a Hindu, lapsed Hindu identity have not found a way of articulating the religious or social religious interests of Hindus without sounding communal, and have often appeared to have defended Muslim faith and interests in bad faith, as if in doing so they were really being communal, but this was permissible given the vulnerability of minorities in a representative democracy dominated by Hindus. The fact is that there is nothing wrong in articulating and defending some Hindu, Muslim, and Christian interests, as long as they do not come into conflict with one another. Attention must be drawn to another problem of Indian secularism. Our education system often fails to distinguish religious instruction and religious education. No publicly funded school or college should have religious instruction. This is best done at home or in privately funded schools. But reasonable, decent education should include elementary knowledge of all religious traditions. A deeper understanding of these traditions is vital, for it would make young students aware of the strengths and weaknesses of their traditions and discern what in them is worth preserving and what is worth discarding. But Indians come out of our education system without a deeper critical understanding of any religious philosophical tradition. As a result, a defense of our own religious traditions or critique of other religious traditions is shallow, it lacks weight, and is frequently mischievous. My last and final point is equally important, and Professor Ganesh has already referred to it. In the last 40 years or so, ever since Mrs. Indira Gandhi played the so-called Hindu card in the early 80s, we have developed a secularism that is a travesty of the original idea, what I call party political secularism, an odd, nefarious doctrine practiced by all political parties, including the so-called secular forces. This secularism has dispelled principles from the core idea and replaced them with opportunism. Opportunistic distance from all religious communities is its slogan. It has removed critical from critical respect and reduced the idea of respect to making deals with the loudest, most fanatical, orthodox, and aggressive sections of every religious group. Thus, political parties keep off religion or intervene as and when it best suits their party or electoral interests. This has led to the unexpected and cynical unlocking in 1986 of the Babri Masjid / Ram Janmabhoomi temple site, the orthodoxy appeasing curtailment of women's rights in the law overturning the Shah Bano judgment, also in 1986, and the indefensible banning of the satanic verses in 1988, all by the Congress party, and to electoral deals with the likes of Imam Bukhari by all and sundry. It has even made states complicit in communal violence. This is a fertile ground for majoritarian Hinduism, whose spokespersons can question all the deal-making and opportunism of party political secularists without examining their own equally unethical practices. The word all is replaced by majority, respect only with the majority religion, never criticize it, but recklessly demonize others. And the state is rid of the corrupt practice of opportunistic distance, not by restoring principal distance, but by magically abolishing distance altogether. This is untrammeled majoritarianism, merely masquerading as secularism. Alas, electoral politics has sidelined or corrupted our constitutional secularism, and the rise of Hindutva has made the Gandhian part of constitutional secularism redundant. To be fair, electoral politics frequently breeds opportunism. If one's only aim is to win, to do so by any means is tempting. But it is here that we need the courts, a free press, an alert citizenry, and civil society activists to move in, to show a mirror to these parties and tell them what they can and cannot do. At present, I'm afraid Indian constitutional secularism is swallowed up by this party political secularism, with not a little help from the opposition, media, and the judiciary. Moreover, since it came to power in 2014, the BJP's majoritarian Asli secularism has done much to undermine the democratic and institutional conditions of constitutional secularism. With the abrogation of the Kashmir-related Article 370, the introduction of the severely discriminatory Citizenship Amendment Act that adds a religious test to the procedure of granting citizenship, the bewildering court judgment on the Ayodhya dispute, and the brazenly partisan handling of the recent communal riots in Delhi, constitutional secularism has been forced to go on the ventilator. Indeed, secularism has already been pronounced dead by many. I suggest that this judgment is premature and unsound, but it does not take a long-term view. As I see it, two crucial moves are needed to kickstart the discourse and practice of secularism. First, a shift of focus from a politically led project to a socially driven movement or justice, particularly within religions. Second, a slight shift of emphasis from inter-religious to intra-religious issues. Recall the birth of the majority-minority syndrome in the late 1920s. Today, a century later, after the formation of Pakistan and the rise of majoritarianism, Indian Muslims appear to have opted out of this syndrome. When this happens, the syndrome implodes. The result has been neither open conflict nor harmony, simply an exiled existence for Muslims in their own homeland. Remember the other debilitating consequence of the syndrome. All dissent within the community is muzzled, and much needed internal reforms are stalled. If so, the collapse of the syndrome unintentionally throws up an opportunity. As the focus shifts from the other to oneself, it may allow deeper introspection within, multiple dissenting voices to resurface, create conditions to root out intra-religious injustices, and make members of religious communities free and equal. After all, the Indian project of secularism has been thwarted as much by party politics as by religious orthodoxy and dogma. For the moment, the state-driven political project of secularism and its legal constitutional form appear to have taken a hit. But precisely this setback can be turned into an opportunity to revitalize the social project of secularism. Since the Indian state has failed to support victims of oppression sanctioned by religion, a peaceful and democratic secularism from below provides a vantage point from which to carry out a much needed internal critique and reform of our own respective religions, to enable their compatibility with constitutional values of equality, liberty, and justice. A collective push from young men and women, untainted by the politics and ideological straitjacking of the recent past, may help strengthen the social struggle of emancipation from intra-religious injustices. Those who most benefit from upholding these constitutional values, the oppressed minorities, Dalits, women, citizens sick to death with zealotry or crass commercialization of their faiths, must together renew this project. I'm not suggesting that secularists must hereby ignore inter-religious issues, but having itself produced disharmony is surely beyond the capacity of the current state to restore communal harmony. But distance, freedom from mutual obsession, give communities breathing space. Each can now explore resources within to construct new ways of living together. The issue here is not simple retrieval of older failed modes of religious toleration. The political project of secularism arose precisely because religious toleration no longer worked. Needed today are new forms of socio-religious reciprocity, crucial for the business of everyday life, and novel ways of reducing the political alienation of citizens, a democratic deficit whose ramifications go far beyond the ambit of secularism. At last, it's time to conclude. I've argued here that secularists who wish or hope for the resurrection of secularism must accept that somewhere down the road, they lost their way. Many of us have allowed Indian secularism to be conflated with Western models, misrecognize the distinctive features of Indian secularism, namely critical respect for and principled distance from all religions. We've also allowed it to be viewed purely as a device for the protection of minorities, rather than be seen equally importantly as fighting caste and gender hierarchies. Many of us fail to recognize that secularism exists as much to fight intra as inter-religious domination, and have allowed the link between secularism and the struggle for Dalit emancipation and gender justice to be broken. I've spoken of other internal flaws. Unless we take corrective conceptual measures, the future of secularism will remain uncertain, even if there is improvement in the social, economic, and political conditions conducive to its growth. Unless we act now, we may find that even when the social and political space for secularism opens up, we may not know what exactly to put there. That would be very tragic indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bhargava, for this very erudite lecture. We were all glued and all there. With this, I invite Professor Faizan Mustafa to please give his chair remarks. Professor Faizan Mustafa.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are.
So what a treat it was this evening listening to Professor Bhargava. And as I said, there is no one better than him to speak on Indian secularism. He's an eternal optimist. And therefore, with all which we have experienced in recent past, he feels that we can do something to revive back legitimacy of secularism. Of all the examples he has picked up, while I'm largely in agreement, and I concede the point that the secularists somewhere lost the direction, but I have a feeling, I'm not saying this at all, that Professor Bhargava in any way undermines the importance of secularism. The way he has articulated the constitutional secularism is the correct constitutional position. Yet I would like to say a few things. When we are mentioning problems with our secularism, what we are largely talking about, and we are talking about 1986 unlocking of Babri Mosque, and then the 1986 overturning of Shah Bano judgment, and then satanic versus ban. Now, I really don't know, but somewhere on these 3 points, which are said to be the time when foundations of aggressive Hindutva were laid, we lost chronology, so to say. And if we go by chronology, this 1986 unlocking decision, if one minutely does month to month, day to day chronology, will probably come first. It was in 85 June that a resolution was passed by the Hindutva groups that by next year's this date in March, we must get this locks broken. There was a movement, they said, right now we are saying unlock it. If you don't unlock it, there will be a break the lock movement. And Rajiv Gandhi conceded to them and promised them it will be done. Therefore, it was first appeasement of the Hindutva forces and then the appeasement of the Muslim forces that in February he promised that I will undo the Shah Bano judgment. Now, about the Shah Bano judgment also, I think so much has been written. There is not a single writing which has said that it was a turning point on Indian secularism. But two things we have forgotten. One, that Shah Bano judgment was not about personal laws. It was a case about Code of Criminal Procedure. Some was seeking maintenance under Code of Criminal Procedure, which is the general law of the land. I think Justice Chandrachud unnecessarily tried to justify his judgment of giving maintenance on the basis of verse 241 of Quran. And I'm really sorry to say, but our judges are obsessed with religion. In spite of Professor Bhargava and mine and other people's interest in secularism, and I'm not saying our judges are not secular, but their religiosity will come in everywhere. Just take the example of euthanasia judgment. There also they are discussing what is death under this religion, what is death under that religion. And many a times they refer to scriptures. When you are deciding a case under the general law of the land, there is no need for you to at all go to any scripture. The precise point in Shah Bano was just this: whether Muhammad Ahmad was entitled to exception under 127. The exception he was claiming under 127 was that if an amount due under customary law has been paid on divorce, then the order of maintenance is to be modified under 125. He was saying that dower is that amount which I have paid to Shah Bano, payable on divorce, therefore my liability comes to an end. I entirely agree with Justice Chandrachud's decision on dower, that dower has nothing to do with divorce. It is a consideration of marriage. It is to be paid to the wife at the time of marriage as a mark of respect. I think he should have just stopped here, that dower is not the amount under Muslim personal law which is payable on divorce, and therefore your liability under 125 stays. Unnecessarily, he went into it. Now, coming to the law which was passed to overturn this decision, to which a mention and correct mention was made by Professor Bhargava. It has been written all over that this law was a huge appeasement of the Muslim minority. It was a great surrender by Rajiv Gandhi to Muslim ulama. There are, different kind of versions. Wajat Habibullah saying something, some people blaming MJ Akbar convincing him. I'm not going into that debate, but look at that this law was challenged in the Supreme Court by Daniel Latifi. And a Daniel Latifi judgment says what? That this law exactly does the same thing which Shah Bano has laid down. And that is why Supreme Court did not find this law as discriminatory, because the whole argument was made that this is a law which is applicable only for Muslim women. And therefore, this is a discrimination based on religion. And that's why the Supreme Court said, no, it is not a discrimination. It is absolutely constitutional. And I feel I will go a step ahead, that with this law, in fact, the liability has increased, because if you go by Code of Criminal Procedure, you have to make a monthly payment thing. Now, Supreme Court, interpreting this new law, has said that the liability of the entire life is to be paid within that period, and therefore the liability has become much greater. About banning of books, there is not one instance in Indian history. There are any number of instances in Indian history where books have been banned. Similarly, overturning of a Supreme Court judgment through Parliament. In 2005, I had calculated, by that time, 110 cases were there where Supreme Court gave some judgment and Parliament overturned it. If you look at in the recent past, look at the SC/ST atrocities judgment of 2nd April, where Justice Goel diluted SC/ST provision. Within months, Parliament sat and overturned it. It's a different story that subsequently the Supreme Court itself recalled its judgment. But there are any Vodafone, take any number of cases where a Supreme Court judgment has been reversed, but this was presented as appeasement of minorities. I take Professor Bhargava's point that in Indian secularism, consideration of minorities' right was very much on the minds of framers of the Constitution. But have we ever bothered to look at what are these minority rights? A reference is again and again made to Article 29 and Article 30. But what is 29? While the heading is saying protection of the interest of the minorities, if you look at the text, which is important, there is no word minority in Article 29. It says any section of Indian citizens having the distinct language, script, or culture of its own shall have the right to conserve the same. Therefore, it is the right of every single citizen. I refuse to accept Article 29 as a minority right special dispensation, which must be deleted from the Constitution. Come to Article 30. What does it talk of? It says minorities, whether based on religion or language, shall have the right to establish and administer educational institutions of their choice. Since all the states were carved out, except this recent Telangana state, on the linguistic basis, each one of us can be a minority, a linguistic minority. A Brahmin of UP, if he goes and settles in Tamil Nadu and sets up a Hindi medium institution, it will be a minority institution. DAV College, an Arya Samaji Hindu college in Jalandhar, when Punjabi medium was imposed under the Punjab Act, was held as a minority institution. Again and again in last 1 year or so, I think more than 7-8 times, some BJP sponsored advocate went to the Supreme Court saying Hindus should be declared as a minority in 8 states. You don't need that order. TMA Pi is very clear from INRE Kerala Education Bill. Consistently, Supreme Court has said minorities are to be defined on the provincial level. And therefore, anyone can be a religious minority and can also be linguistic minority. It is also the right of all citizens. But I want to test the argument with Professor Bhargava, assuming that it is a special dispensation for the minority. So what? Is not the constitutional jurisprudence well settled on this, that there are times when equal rights, general rights are not enough for certain groups, and you need a spatial differentiation, a spatial dispensation. This whole argument of equality of religions, which has now been converted into a new kind of argument by the Hindutva, or what they call the positive secularism, that equality of religions be there. It's a formal understanding of equality, a dated idea of equality. The substantive idea of equality, very well recognized by Indian Supreme Court in number of cases now, recognizes that there can be disadvantaged groups, and their disadvantages are to be taken into account. And I believe if this is so, then even guaranteeing minority rights cannot be such a big deal. But in any case, if you go to Indian Constitution, I will say that Article 30 is no appeasement of minorities. I think the only two articles which are the most direct expression of secularism are Article 27 and 28. A reference was made to Article 28 by Professor Bhargava, and I would like to react it in a minute. But 27, that no religious tax will be there, and the proceeds of no tax shall be used for any specific religion. I think this is the most direct expression of secularism. There has been quite a bogey about Hajj subsidy. Yogi Adityanath government last year, year before, in its budget, provided subsidy for going to Mansarovar. There are subsidies given for all kinds of religious events. I had written a piece for Wire, how much Indian states really spends on religion. Meera Nanda has done a whole book on it, The God Market. But media has built up this argument, and Hindutva has built up this argument that there is a huge, big appeasement of the minorities going on. And so much so that in spite of now BJP rule of 6 years, there is a TV channel who is saying there is a UPSC jihad. Now, if there is a UPSC jihad, the point which is being built up is the current government trying to appease minorities. Now, if that was their whole argument against Congress, and they are doing the very same thing. I think it is the majority which should be questioning them. And this TV channel is trying to present that the current government is doing the appeasement without looking at UPSC. I'm not going into the details of that, but on 28, where we are saying that there should not be religious instruction, I take the point of Professor Bhargava that there has to be a distinction between religious instruction and religious education, and religious education in terms of all religions, basic fundamental principles is not constitutionally prohibited. But the whole point is, look at the government-sponsored central institutions. Year before last, for all 1,553 central schools, the central government issued a directive that there will be this prayer, which if you go by the US or the Canadian precedents, will definitely be held to be invoking the name of God. And somebody in UP, a headmaster, who was having this lappe aati hai dua ban ke tamanna meri, or where word Allah has come, that person was suspended. What the point I am trying to draw home, that I agree with Professor Bhargava that there has been a failure of secularism, but can we entirely blame secularists for it? Can we really say that because secularists sided with the minority rights, because secularists opposed reforms in personal laws, that story is not that simple. If you look at the reforms in Hindu law, it was vociferously opposed by RSS, was opposed by Hindutva. When original Hindu Code Bill was introduced, out of 27 speakers in Lok Sabha, as many as 24 opposed it. The President of the Republic said, I will refuse to sign it. The Law Minister Ambedkar had to resign it under pressure, under pressure. 2 years ago, we have seen the kind of protests we saw post Shahbanu. Of course, I am not justifying those protests. That is the whole point. When Supreme Court goes to religion, the fanatics hijacked by the Muslim fanatics and by the Muslim ulama. And I am not having any brief on their behalf. But that is what exactly happened. In Sabrimala, the position taken by Hindutva forces was that Supreme Court judgment is wrong. It should be reversed. But you have a favorable Supreme Court, which without being pointed out, single error apparent on the face of the record, which is the first condition to accept a review, accepted the review. Not only accepted the review, Justice Ranjan Gogoi led bench, it clubbed all the questions which were not before it, which were not, and that's why Justice Chandrachud and Justice Nariman had to write a powerful dissent. The point I am trying to draw home is very simple, that leftist, secularist intellectuals were all for reforms. I remember my days when I was studying under Professor Irfan Habib. He was all for Uniform Civil Code. But when Uniform Civil Code project, from being a gender justice project, became a project of demeaning a minority community, then these people backtracked. And that's the point which I am trying to make, that we can't be entirely blaming intellectuals and giving as if the majority community or the government has not played any role in the failure of the secular project. Every single day, we observe appeasement of the majority taking place, but media is entirely under the control of the government. It is not written, and no protests happen. And if some protests happen, they are not given the prominence they deserve. Similarly, about citizenship, of course, the religious test is not there and should not be there. Even if tomorrow we become a Hindu Rashtra. In fact, Professor Bhargava will recall that I had written for Indian Express prior to this COVID-19 thing happened, that minorities too are fed up with secularism. I think I am now inclined to go public on this, that okay, remove secularism. Can you believe that when the new government came in and the law day of 26 November became a constitution day, The Attorney General in his speech in Supreme Court, then Attorney General Mr. Mukul Rohatgi, 3 times refers to preamble but does not refer to word secular. Rajnath Singh, as leader of the House in Rajya Sabha and then Home Minister, specifically said, oh, this word was not there in the Constitution, as if every other thing which was there, not there in the Constitution should not be there. All the other things of the 42nd Amendment are acceptable to us. Fundamental duties were also inserted by the 42nd Amendment. What integrity was also inserted by the 42nd Amendment. But we will emphasize fundamental duties at the cost of civil liberties and say, no, this intention of the framers of the Constitution was not there. True that K.T. Shah wanted it, but it was defeated. But this is also true that Kamath wanted God, invocation of God, that was also defeated. But that is neither here nor there, because even without word secular in the text of the Constitution, that will come in 76. In 73 itself, in Keshavananda Bharati, secularism was recognized as a basic structure of the Constitution. I entirely agree with Professor Bhargava that there has been too much of obsession of secularists with the wall of separation. And that obsession is wrong. And that is why, having been a strong secularist for decades, I started now teaching law and religion. And I feel that there has to be a kind of interaction between religion. So what he's saying, that there will be a principled distance as well as critique of religion when it comes to social norms. And I also take his point that the Muslim ulama, by confusing between Sharia and fiqh, have done a disservice. Sharia is something which refers to the relationship of man with God. No state would like to pass laws in respect of your relationship with God. But fiqh is analogical deductions. Fiqh deals with human relations. And for human relations, every state is well within its power to bring and initiate reforms. But in initiating reforms, if the project is that when triple divorce bill is passed, you have slogans of Jai Shri Ram in parliament, and Owaisi, at some other occasion going, I think, for oath, says Allahu Akbar. I think that is dangerous for Indian secularism. I feel if you look at the oath which ministers take, most of our ministers, rather than saying I solemnly affirm, take oath in the name of God. So let us accept, like United States, where constitutionally speaking, you have absolutely Jefferson wall of separation, but most of their presidents have been practicing Christians. We are not saying that public figures should not, follow their religious dictates, but there is an overdose of religiosity. I think the greatest problem, which has not been properly understood by us, that increasingly our religions are having this heavy dose of religiosity devoid of spirituality. There is no spirituality in our religions anymore. If we can bring in that spirituality and look at what Professor Bhargava rightly said, reform within religions, the intra-reforms to which he is saying, maybe people of India can stand up, but with the kind of media we have and with the kind of powerful state we have, I think it's better that we go for some kind of Hindu Rashtra. Let the Hindu fanatics be satisfied. Let them give their wish list. What kind of Hindu Rashtra they want? Is Pakistan and Saudi Arabia their model? Or they want to adopt the jurisdiction model of Great Britain or Greece or some of the European countries to which a reference was made by Professor Bhargava? If you have a Hindu Rashtra, are you going to say that only Hindus will be citizens of India and no Muslim or Christian will have any right of equal opportunity in public jobs? I don't think in 21st century any country, because even Pakistan does not have religious test in their Citizenship Act. So I'm sure that once Hindu Rashtra becomes a reality, it will be more frustrating and disappointing for the proponents of Hindutva, and that will maybe trigger some kind of revival of secularism. Otherwise, whatever suggestions Professor Bhargava has said, that let us not be state-centric, let us look at our society, let intellectuals and people try to revive secularism. I think these are great ideas and probably the only ideas on which we can work. I think it was a huge learning experience for me. I'm in entire agreement with him that if we want to sustain ourselves as a society, or if Nehru is, such a condemned figure today, but he said any government's claim to civilization will be only in the context of a secular state, and a secular state will be what Professor Bhargava explained, that this is what the constitutional secularism all about. It is not irreligious, it is not anti-religion. Somebody asked the question about the atheist. Freedom of religion also means freedom from religions, and therefore Article 25 very much guarantees you that right. I only believe that if we want to be a modern progressive country, some kind of secularism must be revived and strengthened, because after all, secularism is the very core of the modernity, and any theocratic states cannot be said to be a very, very progressive state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mustafa. We have time, unfortunately, for very, very few questions. So I request Subodh and Suraj to kindly read out some important ones.
Can I just very briefly respond to Professor Mustafa?
Sure, of course.
So I just want, I agree with a lot of things that he said, but there's one misunderstanding, a possible misunderstanding, that I need to clarify. Whereas I never use the word minority appeasement. And I do not believe that if there are any minority rights, which I hitherto believed that there were in two of the articles in the Indian Constitution, but Professor Mustafa is a legal scholar. If he tells me that at least one of them doesn't, then I would go by what he's saying. But if there are any minority rights in the Constitution, these are not special dispensations. I entirely agree that the notion of equality has changed. I mean, I think I'm sure he's as much familiar with a distinction that has been there for a long time, but which has been made explicitly by Ronald Dworkin, which is the difference between treating people equally and treating people as equals. And treating people as equals sometimes requires differential treatment.
Right.
So for rights are given to minorities, whether they're linguistic or religious, anywhere, only because they're not able to get things which the majority routinely gets. These are not special. I never believed that these are privileges or special dispensations or anything. Having said that, I was saying that even then it is wrong for us. I mean, it's not wrong. Sometimes it's simply needed in our times, but to get permanently locked into a framework which talks about secularism only in terms of minority rights without addressing caste hierarchies and gender hierarchies, I think that is a problem, because it disconnects the discourse and the politics of the defense of minorities, whether they're Muslims or Christians or wherever, with the discourse of Dalit emancipation and gender justice. I think these should be treated together, because as in India, the distinction, there is no church and there is no, even in, Islam, except for, Christians, I mean, there isn't really a church. There is hard to maintain the distinction between religion and social, religion and cultural. So we will never be able to change anything and transform anything unless we actually intervene in whatever it is that is subsumed under religion. So I think this is as important as addressing the issue of interreligious domination. Both are equally important and both should be seen together. That was my only point.
No,
I entirely...
I also agree with you, sir. So the constitution thought like this, that they had addressed the question of caste in Article 14, 15, 16, 17, and 335. That was their, the framers had this in mind. But I'm with you on this issue. But we have to look at what challenges were posed to secularism. So Hindus were depicted as victims. For instance, they say that Hindu temples' money, is being used, and Waqf money and Waqf people are having freedom. No, this is a myth. I think we will do a great service to the cause of secularism if we can try to really dispel these myths. You have as many as 27 Waqf acts so far, and all Waqf acts given equal, almost equal or greater state control in respect of religious properties of Muslims. Similarly, about all this Hindu religious and endowment acts, because there were problems of corruption, and since temples have so many, offerings and money, so they said that this is a secular function, and that's why we are bringing in administration. But I think in entire debate, we have not looked at what are the grievances of Hindutva. And these are their grievances, that being a Hindutva means, being a Hindu means that you don't have enough rights. I think we need to dispel this, that Hindus too have same rights. In fact, they have rights even under Article 30. And of course, Article 29 does not talk of minorities at all.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm not in disagreement with that. And thank you for all the legal points that you made. I've learned from them, and I will continue to learn from on law.
I learned it. Thank you. Now I invite Subodh Bedre to read out some questions from the chat box. Subodh Bedre is member of Center for Study of Society and Secularism. He does lot of social work in the field of education for the marginalized, and is also an entrepreneur. So Subodh. And will be assisted by Suraj Nair. Suraj is working with the Center for Study of Society and Secularism. Subodh?
Yeah, correct.
Yes, please go ahead.
It was both the lecture and the views expressed by Professor Faizan, both were so strong, and we have had so many questions, but unfortunately not much time. So I'll quickly rush to one or two of the questions. One is asked by Sahiba More, who wants to know that in spite of such an enlightened constitution, why is there this current state of affairs? Why is this crisis of secularism still there? Professor, it was addressed to Professor Bhargava.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are, I tried to divide it into two parts. One is external factors which are have undermined all the social and political conditions for the growth and even the existence of a proper secular state. This is very little to do with the internal discourse of secularism. Secularists haven't done very much in this matter. A large number of Indians are victims of these developments, which have been occurring for a good, 40 years now. But then there are also internal factors. You see, we have to project secularism in a way that appeals to large sections of Indian people. Most of them, a large number of them are Hindus. So the question is how to put across secularism in a way that will also appeal to Hindus, because secularism is not just for Muslims, it's for everybody. And what has happened is that in our discourse, it appears as if Hindus have very little to do with it and they have very little to benefit from it. And that is what I find very So I think we have to reshape our discourse in such a way, because that is what we have to address. That's the issue. I don't, it's very ironical that Muslims and Christians and Sikhs, and all the minorities are for secularism. The majority is turned against it, or at least large sections of it. And the Dalits are also seem to be indifferent. And a large number of women also don't seem to bother. They don't think that they are going to benefit from it. I mean, if you look at the voting pattern, you realize what I'm talking about. Now, it's that reality that we have to address. If secularism has to be refashioned and reinvented, if secularism has to regain its ground, we have to reshape secularism in a way which appeals to everybody. And that's what I tried to do here. I don't, as I said right in the beginning, I don't mean to place the blame on secularists for the crisis, but I think the secularists also need to at least take some part of the blame.
Correct. Okay. Now, quickly, one more question, because there's really not much time. This is to both Professor Bhargava and Professor Faizan. Is that asked by Anshika Singh and in different ways by a couple of other people. They're saying that with the current youth of this country losing interest in Indian politics, and with the stress that is being laid on social media, do you really think that we have that secularism has a future in India? Now, looking at Professor Faizan's comments, I would think that he has lost hope that there is hope for secularism in India. But I would like both of you to respond. A lot of people are asking this. So is there hope given today's youth?
Faizan sahab, aap boliye.
Sir, if our youth are involved in mob lynching, look at the average age of people who are indulging in mob lynching, then I'm really disappointed. And, when I was a child, I think that people in rural areas, were secular. Only in urban areas, you had communal riots. But lately, I feel that this virus of communalism has, reached even rural areas. But I think if we have to really save secularism, of course, what Professor Bhargava rightly said, that you need a big social transformation and reforms within religions, I think judiciary has to play a leading role. Our judiciary, is starting from reforms which they tried to do through essentiality test in 50s and 60s and tried to reform religions. It is none of the business of the court to reform a religion, isn't so? And then the kind of comments they started making about uniform civil code, largely obiter dicta. And then finally the Hindutva judgment, which gave legitimacy to the Hindutva ideology and BJP. I feel the court has been contributing to the rise of, this kind of feeling. They can always say in SR Bomai, we talked about secularism and this and that and held basic structure. But I feel that the court has not been really upholding secularism in each and every case.
My brief answer is that I think India as a country will find it very difficult to survive if India is not secular.
Okay.
And therefore, I would say that we shouldn't lose hope, because if we do lose hope, then I think we've given up hope I think it's our survival which is at stake. I don't think we can survive in any form in India if there is no secular. We can shift, the way that I think of secularism is flexible enough for us to change things around depending on the context, as long as we keep the big picture in mind. So I would say that we could go in the direction of individual rights. Maybe we should do that for the time being, maybe what Faizan Sahab was saying about, these are for there are no minority rights. Maybe we should let minority rights remain disguised and not talk about them, and just talk about individual rights for some time before things change, and we can talk about just what I said, that these are not any special things. I mean, this is just to treat people as equals. But maybe there is no space at the moment for it. Although, I mean, in every article that I write for the Hindu, I always mention something like that.
But
I
don't
say,
you think, sir, that things have to get worse before they improve?
Worse than now. Worse than now, really.
I mean, if things go really, I mean, we are talking about something which would be really disastrous. I mean, we are already in what you said. It's practically, we're living in practically a Hindu Rashtra. I mean, I wish we had not introduced the word secular in the Constitution. Secularism is distributed. I mean, you don't have to have a word. The Indian Constitution was secular. It was scattered all over.
We don't have word separation of powers and federalism in the Constitution, but they're very much there.
Yes, I mean, I look at this irony. 1976, you introduced the word, and the problems begin within a few years of that.
Yeah.
In a major way.
Right.
I think sometimes, this is a great wisdom, sometimes we should leave things unnamed. That ambiguity is important. Leave them as they are. I think there was a wisdom in not having the word secular in the Constitution.
Right, right.
And I think the introduction of that word has ruined many things.
True.
Don't have to make everything explicit.
I agree.
So I cannot take a very deeply pessimistic public stance. Privately, Faizan Sahab, I will sit with you someday and we will talk about what we think about the present situation. I'm sure everybody will agree. But I simply cannot. I mean, I think there are young people there who are waiting for some guidance from all of us.
Sir, your writings bring some hope to everyone.
I don't know. I mean, I just feel that we cannot afford to give up.
Right, right.
We can just, move from one. I think we were wrong not having understood what our Constitution. We lived in a time, when political science was taught and the Constitution was not even taught there. Right. We don't study legal cases. Right. We have no risk. We've had a tradition of not respecting the Constitution by the left and by the right. We've been basically taking the carpet from under our feet by not properly defending them at the appropriate period, and we're paying the cost for it.
Right, right, absolutely.
So, I mean, this is something which, in a way, nobody deserves what we are going through right now. But in a way, we made instrumental uses of these things. There is intrinsic value in what our Constitution has to say. And we should have always defended it, that we could have gone beyond it to improve it. There are lots of things to improve in the Constitution. But we should have taken as a basic document, and there should have been a huge amount of defenses of the Constitution for the last 50, 60 years. I was surprised that in a moral defense of the Constitution, maybe I'm completely wrong about this, but a proper moral defense of the Constitution, apart from Granville Austin and so on, but from a political theorist, that edited book which had all these people, all the political theorists, that was the first of its kind. This was in 2003-04. Why did it take us so long? So we are guilty. Many of us we've not done justice to some of the things that our founders had laid for us. And we are paying the price for it. we moved away from some of those things.
Correct, correct.
Thank you so much, Professor. Now I would like to invite Professor Farooq Waris to propose a formal thank you.
May I say just one sentence? Both the presentations were very erudite. Although there are many questions in the chat box, if you revisit this video on the Facebook page of Center for Study of Society and Secularism, you might get your answers by seeing this once again and thinking for yourself. Both presentations were very erudite, and thank you. We have hope and also a direction in which we should go ahead. We have both the presentations helped us reflect where we went wrong, where the secularists went wrong and made mistakes, and hopefully will overcome. We have bottomed out, and from now on there is road ahead to secularism and good future of India. Thank you both from the bottom of my heart. And we now invite Professor Farooq Waris. She is retired principal of Burhani College, professor of history, and also member of Indian Muslims for Democracy. And she often speaks as a guiding light of Indian Muslims for Democracy. And she's board member of Center for Study of Society and Secularism. Professor Farooq Waris. Are you unmuted? Professor Waris? Suraj?
Yeah, I've made her the co-host. Let me check once again.
Professor?
Suraj, unmute.
Yes, yes, I have.
Professor Waris is there. Please unmute yourself.
Professor Waris,
Please.
you are the co-host. You could unmute.
You are co-host. You can unmute yourself. Yes.
I think.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I think I can be heard now.
Yes.
Yes.
Absolute intellectual ecstasy. Absolutely. But let me put it in a more structured way. What is required, vote of thanks is required to say that it is, I'm here, I'm Farooq Waris, adab to everybody. And I'm speaking on behalf of Center for the Study of Society and Secularism. It is my great pleasure and honor to thank Professor Rajeev Bhargava for his brilliant deliverance on Does Indian Secularism Have a Future? On the occasion of 16th Dr. Asghar Ali Engineer Memorial Lecture. The session was aptly, very nicely chaired by Professor Faizan Mustafa. I would also like to thank in the same esteem the director of CSSS, Janab Irfan Engineer Saab, who manages to invite scholars par excellence year after year, which aptly honors the legendary scholarship of his father, Dr. Asghar Ali Engineer. A big thanks to MS Sandhya Matre, Neha Dhabare, Suraj Nair, and the support techno team of CSSS, without whose enthusiastic assistance we wouldn't have been able to have some 400 participants and very actively participating. I'm also obliged to each and every participant who's present here. Your participation and suggestions always help us. A big thank you to the managing committee and their knowledgeable inputs, which mainly contributed to the large viewership of this great session. Just one or two lines in the end. Both the presentations were fantastic. I don't have expressions enough to put my thoughts into words. Little depressed with what Faizan Mustafa Saab said. I think I'm much older to you, and I am really hopeful that if we, the people, the citizens of India, have the moral will we can secure, we can protect our secularism. We don't have to give up hopes. I come from the Hindi belt of Lucknow, Aligarh, and Allahabad, where, as Professor Rajeev Bhargava said, there is more of intra communalism, intra-caste biases than inter. In fact, all through my schooling, which was 50s and 60s, I did not hear so much of Muslims being targeted as that as the lower caste communities were targeted. So let's not lose hope. Let's still be about where we are. It's like, in the end, I'll say it's like when dowry was banned, nobody has stopped giving dowry, but our hands are empowered, strengthened. If we don't want to give it, we always use the ban, the name of the ban. So let secularism live its life. Let secularism remain where it is, and not think of India without secularism added there. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.